Hey everyone, welcome back to Bible class. The Bible is full of examples of God's faithfulness, but one book stands out as unique. The Book of Esther never directly mentions God's name, but his hand is at work in every detail. Esther tells the story of a Jewish woman who becomes the queen of Persia at a time when her people are threatened with destruction. Through a series of unexpected events, she finds herself in a position to save them, at great personal risk. To this day, the Jewish people celebrate Purim to remember this miraculous deliverance. It's a joyful festival marked by reading the Book of Esther, sharing food, and giving gifts to those in need. And while Purim might not be something that most Christians are even aware of, it has some remarkable connections to our faith. After all, Esther's story is one of redemption, intercession, and victory over the enemy, themes that point us directly to Jesus. We've already made a video exploring some of the major themes and ideas in the Book of Esther, as well as a wild connection to the Nuremberg trials. There will be a link to that video at the end, but there are other details in this book that we've got to explore. As Christians, we are sadly mostly ignorant to all things related to the biblical calendar, so we often miss details hidden in plain sight. There is one of those calendar details in the Book of Esther that I want to explore with you today, and I think it's going to reveal a shocking connection between the Book of Esther and the death and resurrection of Jesus. When we understand this connection, Esther's narrative takes on a whole new depth. So let's dive into the text. We're going to jump into the narrative in chapter 3. Esther has already become queen, and Mordecai has just uncovered a plot to assassinate the king. But instead of Mordecai being rewarded, Haman the Agagite is elevated to second in command in all of Persia. When everyone is commanded to bow before Haman, Mordecai refuses. This infuriates Haman, but instead of taking out his anger on just Mordecai, he decides to kill all of the Jews throughout the Persian Empire. But then Haman has to decide when to do it. When would be the most auspicious time to perform a genocide? You see, Haman represents a worldview of chance and randomness, in contrast to the biblical worldview of planning and purpose. Haman decides to cast lots, or in Hebrew, pur, to choose the day for the demise of the Jewish people. This is where we get the name of the festival, Purim. Haman's plot is to decide at random what day the Jews should be annihilated. But little did he know that God is the ultimate planner and always has a purpose. Even within Haman's plan to be random, God shows his hand of foreknowledge. The world isn't random. We aren't the result of millions of mistakes and genetic accidents. We are here for a purpose, and God's hand is intimately involved even when we can't see it. Sometimes it's hiding in plain sight. You see, a detail is given in Esther 3:7 that we often just skim right over. We read, in the 12th year of King Xerxes, in the first month, the month of Nisan, the pur, that is the lot, was cast before Haman to determine a day and month. And the lot fell on the 12th month, the month of Adar. This calendar detail is often overlooked, but has tremendous significance. The first month, the month of Nisan, is the month of Passover. Leviticus 23, the best chapter for learning about God's calendar, tells us that the Passover to the Lord begins at twilight on the 14th day of the first month. So Haman is picking his date for the annihilation of the Jews in the same month that God brought Israel out of exile. This was during the month of redemption. Jews all over Persia would be preparing to celebrate the Passover and commemorate the Exodus from Egypt, getting ready to celebrate God's deliverance at the exact same time that Haman is plotting their ultimate demise. This detail wouldn't have been lost on Haman, and certainly not on the Jewish audience of the Book of Esther. To recontextualize for us in America, this would be like the British plotting to take over America on July 1st. We'd all understand the irony with its proximity to the 4th of July, our Independence Day. Sadly, we often miss the calendar details given in the Bible, but are very familiar with the man-made holidays observed in most of the Western world. And if you're hearing this and thinking to yourself, yeah, but those aren't our holidays. We don't do Purim or Passover. The Jews have different laws than we do. Realize that you're making the same exact argument that Haman made to the king. In verse 8, Haman tells the king, "There is a certain people scattered and dispersed among the peoples of every province in your kingdom. Their laws are different from everyone else's, and they do not obey the king's laws." Notice that Haman specifically targets the laws of the Jews. Haman didn't just hate the Jewish people, he hated the laws of the Jewish people. But really, whose laws were the Jews following? God's laws. God gave his law to the Jewish people at Mount Sinai. The more someone follows the laws of God, the more they will be despised by the world. Hatred for the Jewish people, at its core, is a hatred for God. All anti-Semitism is rooted in a hatred for the God of Israel. This "their laws are different from everyone else's" argument worked to sway the king. And it's worked to sway many Christians into anti-Semitic theology and behaviors. But now the text of Esther 3 provides us with not only a month, but also the day of the month. We're told on the 13th day of the first month, the royal scribes were summoned and the order was written exactly as Haman commanded. Now, this might not mean much to you, but if you're familiar with the biblical calendar, then you know that this is the day before Passover. Passover is on the 14th day of the first month. Haman has the decree written out and proclaimed in the city streets on the day before Passover. Again, the day that the Jewish people were getting ready to celebrate and commemorate their exodus from Egypt. They received word that on the 13th day of the 12th month of Adar, all the Jews were to be annihilated. No wonder that the city was thrown into confusion. Yes, the actual annihilation wasn't going to take place for 11 months, but this is the day that Haman chose to announce the slaughter. This was not by accident. But in the palace, Queen Esther is unaware of this decree and has no idea what's going on out in the streets. So Mordecai needs to get word to Esther that she has to intervene. At first, Esther was reluctant to go before the king as it could cost her her life, but Mordecai is able to convince her with the famous "for such a time as this" line. But then Esther tells Mordecai to go and assemble all the Jews who can be found in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day, and I and my maidens will fast as you do. After that, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. This raises a couple of questions, like, why 3 days? The Jewish Midrash offers an interesting note of commentary. The rabbis argue that God never leaves his people in distress for more than 3 days. They point to Abraham lifting his eyes and seeing the place in the distance on the 3rd day, and Joseph putting his brothers in prison in Egypt for 3 days, and even Jonah being in the belly of a fish for 3 days and 3 nights. That's a pretty important reference because I'm pretty sure someone else uses the sign of Jonah to point to a 3-day and 3-night period of time. But the rabbis continue to say that in the end days, when the dead are resurrected, for they will be restored to life only after 3 days. As it is written, he will bring us to life for 2 days. On the 3rd day, he will raise us up and we will live before him. Did you just hear that? According to the rabbinic commentary, citing Abraham's binding of Isaac and Jonah in the belly of a fish, the fast of Queen Esther is pointing us towards the resurrection of the dead. That at Passover, Esther calls for a 3-day fast, night and day, at the exact same time that in the future, Jesus would be in the tomb for 3 days and 3 nights. You see, Jesus is crucified at Passover and then spends 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the earth, just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a fish. We've got a whole video explaining how we can derive from the text that Jesus is crucified at Passover, and there will be a link at the end of this video if you haven't checked that out yet. But you need to see this. The fast of Esther is taking place at the exact same time on the calendar that Jesus is in the tomb, for 3 days and 3 nights. Esther even makes sure to specify night and day. The foreshadowing here is incredible. Just as the disciples and followers of Jesus were thrown into confusion at the arrest and crucifixion of Jesus, so the Jewish people were with the decree of Haman that all the Jews would be annihilated. All hope seemed lost. There was no escaping the ultimate demise of death. But 3 days and 3 nights later, Jesus rose from the dead at the exact same time on the calendar that Queen Esther went before the king and he extended the golden scepter, granting her life. This climactic moment in the Book of Esther is pointing us directly to Jesus' death and resurrection. You can't make this stuff up. But how sad is it that this amazing connection and detail plainly written in the text is missed because we don't understand the biblical calendar. So when Purim comes around each year, let's not be like Haman and say, we don't do that Jewish stuff like Purim. Rather, let's pause and realize that God's hand is intimately involved in our lives and that nothing is the result of chance and randomness. Let's realize that the Bible, from beginning to end, is a cohesive and connective narrative pointing us to Jesus. So I'd like to encourage you to check out our video on the date on the calendar of Jesus' crucifixion, or to check out our other video on the Book of Esther to see an amazing connection between Mark Twain, the Book of Esther, and the Nazis. You won't want to miss that one. And enjoy the rest of your day here at Bible class.